It was my honor to nominate her based on an assignment from English 219, which is honors composition, in which the students were asked to look at a work we had studied in another genre. And we looked at 3 films based on 3 novels we were dealing with. And it'll speak for itself. It's my pleasure to introduce Jennie Tanner.
Growing up on the Mississippi. The growth of a child into a fully functioning adult is an incredible thing if one thinks about it long enough. A person is born without knowledge, without any skills at all. Within a few decades, he has learned from scratch how to be human. He grows through many versions of himself before arriving at even his first adult self. And what makes this incarnation an adult self? Where do these qualities come from? Is he really just a product of the way he is raised? Anne Frank wrote, "Parents can give good advice or put them on the right paths, but the final forming of a person's character lies in their own hands. At a certain time in a person's life, he must take responsibility for who he is. He must synthesize all that he has learned from adults, experience, and his inner self. He must make decisions about the precepts he will keep and the ones he will discard. A child truly grows up when he finds the courage to do what he knows in his heart is right, even when it is against what society says he must do." This idea lies at the heart of Mark Twain's novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, wherein Huck, the protagonist, abandons the belief he has been taught about race in favor of what his conscience tells him is moral. One passage that exemplifies this concept comes from a point where Huck is contemplating sending a letter that would doom his friend Jim to slavery for life. He is faced with a clear choice between humanity and conforming to societal codes. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling because I got to decide forever betwixt 2 things, and I knowed it. I stayed a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. Though young Huck still speaks as if he equates conformity with correct behavior, he has rejected the societal norms on a deep level. The novel is about Huck maturing enough to follow his innate morality and leave his old life behind. Any interpretation or version of Huck Finn that would trivialize or water down this idea is sadly mistaken. The 1939 movie, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, directed by Richard Ford, is sadly mistaken. While it does do some justice to Huck's relationship with Jim and subsequent change of heart about race, the film leaves its protagonist in the same state of immaturity he was in before rafting down the Mississippi. Its fairy tale ending, wherein Huck stays with his caretaker, the widow Douglas, instead of heading west, takes away the gravity of Huck's coming of age. In the novel, Huck comes to feel a mature disgust for his culture. The film has him return willingly to his old life, ending with a scene of maudlin whimsy meant to show viewers that he is still the same little boy as before. The film, in effect, turns a deeply moral Bildungsroman into nothing more than a sweet story that makes a good point about racial equality. The movie's main focus, as mentioned before, is centered on Huck's and Jim's relationship. It is portrayed as very sweet, almost saccharine, with many of the darker parts of Jim's character conveniently left out, such as the disturbing incident in which he slaps his deaf daughter unaware of her disability. Without his faults and low points, Jim begins to feel almost like an Uncle Tom character, a vaguely condescending archetype of what 1930s America thought was a good black person. Ironically, Twain's novel, written in the midst of the Jim Crow era, treated Jim with much more realism than the movie that came 55 years later. While the film's Huck does, of course, reach the realization that racism is wrong, his change of heart feels shallower because it lacks the full weight of the human experience found in the novel. In fact, everything in the film is kept at a fairly childlike level. The characters are static, and the plot is streamlined and changed into a simple there and back again story. While Twain's novel is a very adult book disguised as a child's book, the film is genuinely a child's movie. This is particularly clear when Huck hops aboard an opportune ship to dramatically save Jim from a mob, a scene which is a bit too cliche to have come from the novel. The adaptation is so simplified that Huck's friend, Tom Sawyer, is completely written out of the script. Since Huck never comes of age, Tom would serve no real purpose as Huck's foil. In the novel, however, Twain creates interesting comparisons between Huck and Tom that bookend the narrative. In the beginning, they are both comparably immature boys who care quite a lot about impressing each other. By the end, Huck has matured so much that he cannot even relate to Tom, and certainly no longer cares about dazzling him with his antics. On the contrary, he becomes rather impatient with Tom's carefree attitude. Mickey Rooney's Huck manages to manifest no such sign of growing world-weary or cynical. The most glaring difference between the book and the movie is, of course, the fact that the film's Huck decided to stay with the widow Douglas instead of leave for the West. In the book, after all Huck has seen of human nature, he becomes so disgusted with slavery and society in general that he cannot stand the thought of living in his hometown of St. Petersburg anymore. This single action of lighting out for the West speaks volumes more than any words Huck could say about how much he has grown. He no longer needs to be taken care of, and in fact has grown in such a way that he could not conscientiously continue to live in the place they grew up. Also, it lends metaphorical resonance to the journey itself, a permanent journey away from prejudice that loses weight if Huck returns home again. In the film, however, Huck has no problem living in the midst of slavery as long as his request that Jim be freed is granted. He expresses his belief that no human being has a right to own another human being, and yet does not seem to be independent enough to leave a culture founded in something he believes is wrong. Twain's intention of heavy social criticism is mostly lost in translation in the film. It is not only slavery, but a general culture of hypocrisy that repels the novel's Huck. This is shown clearly in an incident with a mob that Huck witnesses. The man the mob is after, Sherburne, explicitly states Twain's view of society as a cowardly system that breeds selfishness. Though Huck rarely comments on his onshore adventures, it becomes apparent that the more of the world he sees, the more he is bothered by it. This contributes to his growing up as much as anything else. He sees so much of the civilized world that he becomes completely disillusioned. Needless to say, this is not seen in the film adaptation. Indeed, the film weakens Twain's intention of Huck Finn as a coming-of-age story. Mickey Rooney's Huck is never faced with a difficult choice, such as sending a letter that would enslave Jim again, as in the quoted passage. He never truly turns his back on the way he was raised in order to follow his conscience. He does rebel against society by helping Jim escape, but in the end feels no need to break with it. If growing up means choosing to do what is right at all costs, then this Huck does not even have the chance to come of age. He never quite confronts a situation where he must either abandon his ideas once and for all, or sacrifice his own conscience. The novel's Huck, on the other hand, does have to make these crucial decisions. He feels so deeply and sees so much that he feels compelled to leave his old life behind, along with his childhood. Despite the widow Douglas' best efforts, Huck will not be civilized. He takes the final responsibility for his own growth as a human